Ellen Road, home of the greats. Bremner, Gray, Lorimer, Reaney, Charlton, Hunter, Clark, Giles, Collins, the King John Charles, all under the peerless Don Revie. In more recent times, McAllister, Strachan, Dorigo, Chapman, Martin, Viduka, Badayaboa and Gary Kelly. For more than 80 years, names have graced this famous old stadium. Promotions, championships, honours, league and FA Cups. Every domestic honour has come their way. And now, disgrace here. And unfortunately, the darkest hour, the darkest day in the club's history, forever tainted by the fans on the pitch right now. And the names of Dennis Wise and Ken Bates will not be remembered kindly for what has happened to this club over the last few months.
리즈시절 is a phrase used in South Korea that translates to Leeds Days and refers to somebody's golden age. Leeds were certainly out of there, 리즈시절 plummeting from the Champions League semi-final to League One in less than a decade. But were these new Leeds days actually quite fun? Leeds United had woken up from living the dream and entered their deepest nightmare. The club was in financial ruin, they were back to where Howard Wilkinson had picked them up all those years ago in the late 1980s, and only now there were no adults running the show. Taking over from Eddie Gray was Kevin Blackwell, and he inherited one of the biggest messes English football had ever seen. Very few players from their heyday remained as the fire sale began, from the three transfers of Danny Mills, Dominic Matteo and Michael Bridges to the inadequate money recouped for talent like James Milner, Mark Viduka and Paul Robinson. Before the ultimate humiliation, Alan Smith signed for Manchester United. The local boy had just gone to the literal devils. In their place were players past their prime in Julian Joachim, Steve Guppy and Brian Deane, those that never had a prime. To begin with, Michael Ricketts and Danny Pugh.
Hits it left footed, takes a wicked deflection. And Neil Sullivan was big now, 14, stretching the Leeds defence once again. There's Roberts.
And Kevin Blackwell's men were getting to grips with the demands of the championship.
He's in the centre, Bullard still, and he'll score.
His situation McLaren takes, and Marcus back heel, and it's been forced in.
37 players were used in the 2004-5 campaign, and that hellacious turnover was enough to have them 19th by Christmas Day and fearing the worst. Thankfully, a more solid second half of the season restored Leeds, but only to the anonymity of mid-table. That summer the whirling dervish of Leeds United quickened again, only they were lethal, saleable products from the academy that had been so fruitful in the 90s. All that was left was Aaron Lennon, who left for a nominal fee. Meanwhile, Seth Johnson snuck out on a Bosman back to Derby, whilst other famous names in Lucas Radaby and Eric Backer departed for nothing.
Fraser Richardson for Leeds. It was behind Holt. Not Lewis though, and Leeds are in front.
And whilst Leeds were 90 minutes away from the Premier League, in their final 10 matches they had soiled the entire campaign by winning only one league fixture. It plummeted them into the playoffs, a space Leeds would become increasingly wary of in the intervening years.
Stop him. They can't. It is Eddie Lewis. Gary Kelly's corner. It's a good one. Could Leeds be heading to Cardiff? Holt in the hunt again. And Fraser Richardson. It's in. He has scored. It is 2-0 to Leeds. And Ashley Young delivers. And Jay delivers. Throw dive, moving on towards Mackay Henderson and James Chambers. Oh, it's Henderson!
Behind the scenes though, all was not well, and that's to say the very fucking least.
Alright, here's the 411, folks.
A consortium by the name of Agilent Force took over, lasted 6 weeks before a fresh takeover was being demanded, but they remained, promising that they could pay off the club's £20 million debt if they returned to the Premier League, which you've just seen They had not. They tried to sell 20-year season tickets and only 100 were ballsy enough to take them up on the offer. Instead of reducing the debt they added to it, took 8 mortgages out on Leeds property, sold off 4 parts before leasing it back with a buyback option, then they defaulted on a £2 million payment to Inland Revenue, not people to be owing money to, before the club finally underwent a takeover in January 2005. Hello, Ken Bates, whose arrival thwarted administration and allowed Leeds to be a little bit more structured ahead of the promotion push in 2006, which you've just seen. He then promised to keep the club out of administration, increased ticket prices, sacked Kevin Blackwell and sold off Ellen Road to some mysterious hooded figure from the British Virgin Islands to do so, before hiring Dennis Wise with the club skirting relegation to League One, and they went into administration anyway. If the clubs were in shambles beforehand, they certainly were now. With 5 matches left, Leeds were only a point away from the relegation zone, and it was still Dennis Wise tasked with saving the club.
As the final whistle blew, it was clear that although they weren't technically down, they'd need a 9-goal reverse against Hull on the final day. It felt like relegation because, frankly, it was.
I'll take full responsibility for the whole situation.
This was uncharted territory. For as bad as things got before names like Don Revie showed up in the 60s or Howard Wilkinson rocked into view in the late 80s, Leeds had never sunk into the 3rd tier of English football. Nor had they become so insolvent that the very future of the club was at risk. Both in the summer of 2007 were a cold hard reality. But at least League One should be fun. Fun, maybe. Successful, nowhere near. Leeds United had won 91 points out there on the pitch, and yet they found themselves behind the automatically promoted Nottingham Forest, who had 82 points, and both Doncaster Rovers and Carlisle United, who had 80. Cue Mo Sislak once again.
Alright, here's the 4-1-1, folks.
After missing payments totalling £200,000 to HMRC, another organisation you really don't want to owe money to, they now kindly requested the full amount owed of £5 million by the end of June. The administration we spoke of earlier, that Bates promised he wouldn't do, happened. Leeds were laughably docked 10 points despite being assured of relegation anyway, as Ken Bates tried to sneakily pay off some of their 1,350 creditors at just 1% by fixing a vote and transferring ownership to himself, and unsurprisingly that didn't go down well. Despite attempts by the club to trot out statements headlined Leeds United 0, Taxman 1, the EFL and its clubs voted to overwhelmingly punish the club. That punishment, 15 points. Bates went into overdrive, booting out BBC radio commentary in favour of his own personally owned radio team, barred local publications from reporting on them, and come pre-season, the club were playing in old kits with old sponsors taped over. This 6 years after being 90 minutes away from a Champions League final. Dennis Wise then ran off to Newcastle United to take up a more lucrative job, allowing a man who actually cared about the club to take over, Gary McAllister. Again, the playoffs.
On the volley, he's done it, and it's in. It's 2-0 and Mark Bridge Wilkinson. All very pretty, but it's not effective. There's Huntington, might just be one last effort here for Leeds. Handel climbing forward, is he going to break forward? Off target. It's a better one. With at least a calming influence from the dugout, Leeds briefly resembled a coherent place, at least in the controllable atmosphere of a match day. Players like Robert Snodgrass, Luciano Becchio and Fabian Delph turned up, but still, Leeds suffered. Decent cross, and there's the opening goal!
Outside of the playoffs, Gary McAllister was sacked midway through the campaign. The man now tasked with taking Leeds up was Simon Grayson, another man who deeply cared about the club, but this time he could marry that with experience. Jermaine Beckford started to score more prolifically, players like Richard Naylor were acquired, and of course the rich vein of form meant only the playoffs, which in turn meant this.
Waiting in the middle was Harris, has got a chance here. Neil Harris from Millwall has scored!
It was obvious now that there was some kind of curse over the club in the playoffs. Some might argue convincingly there still is. Therefore, they needed to get into that top 2 to go up automatically. Best way to start thinking of that naturally was to sell Fabian Delph for £6 million, and not only that, with the deadline of Thorpe Archer's buyback clause also conveniently placed around £6 million, Ken Bates allowed it to lapse. Leeds United entered the 2009-10 season their third in the third tier of English football in a much weaker position. Through the experience of Grace and the acquisition of players like Patrick Kisnorbo, Michael Doyle and Max Gradle, they had done it. Leeds were back in the Championship with a sigh of palpable relief. And it probably wasn't even the most enjoyable part of their season. Nah, that had come 5 months beforehand.
And this is Beckford, he just ran away from him, but he'll still get a striking and goal. And score at the Stretford end for Leeds United. And it doesn't get any better than that.
Leeds United were back. They were upwardly mobile and had momentum carried right through the club thanks to their manager and thanks to young and hungry talent. More and more was being unearthed by the day. Johnny Howson and Bradley Johnson were entering peak years. Together with a strike partnership in Becchio and Beckford, Leeds would be a match for anybody. Then naturally, Jermaine Beckford was sold to Everton. Cardiff's Ross McCormack was his replacement and didn't get up to speed immediately, whilst Adam Clayton was sourced from the Manchester City Academy and not ready yet. Behind them, a young goalkeeper by the name of Kasper Schmeichel. A season that should have been one of celebration went a bit like this. The club were housed within the dreaded but somehow comforting playoffs practically all season, then it all went awry, and obviously Ken Bates was involved. Go on, Mo.
Alright, here's the 4-1-1, folks.
With the club heading towards a potential promotion at the first time of asking, Bates stuck himself into the middle of 2 contract situations and rejected the idea that Bradley Johnson and Neil Kilkenny needed a contract before thwarting all moves for defensive reinforcements that Simon Grayson had previously signed off on. Leeds finished 3 points off the playoffs, sold both Johnson and Kilkenny as well as Schmeichel for good measure. Their replacements were laughable. 34-year-old Michael Brown with 2 goalkeepers in Paul Rachugba and Annie Lonergan were signed. Money was now being spent on executive suites and officers as opposed to players, fees dwarfed by the legal costs of Bates' ramblings in the weekly programme notes. Then there was a small matter of the Premier League wanting to know who actually owned Elland Road and consequently a large chunk of the club. You know, should Leeds actually get promoted? Bates said nuh-uh and continued to tank the club. Max Gradle was sold to Saint Etienne with Danny Pugh bought back to fill his vacancy. Then the unofficial arrangement of Leeds United being a feeder club for Norwich fucking City continued. Johnny Howson following Bradley Johnson. Don't worry, that's a trend that would continue into the following summer when both Robert Snodgrass and Luciano Becchio both decided to chip to Carrow Road. Who'd fill all these voids? Robbie Rogers on a free, obviously. You're probably thinking who? Most Leeds United fans were, as he played just 4 times before sneaking off to Stevenage on loan as Simon Grayson told Bates to stick his job up his arse, and as if to try to add petrol onto an already smouldering wreckage, Neil Warnock was hired. The renter quote Warnock was returning the club to 14th before mercifully Ken Bates finally sold the club. Now you're thinking surely things can't get much worse. As Neil Warnock was signing players he would go on to call sewer rats, no not Paddy Kenny, El Hadj Diouf, Bates handed the club to the romantically named Gulf Finance House Capital. No track record in football, it didn't matter because Leeds United had stopped being a football club years ago. Warnock didn't last much longer after his own player Ross McCormack told him to fuck off mid-match. In came Brian McDermott and things were actually alright at first. At first, the January window came along and the club refused McDermott his desired signing of Ashley Barnes because the ownership compared him with Luke Varney's stats on Football Manager. Their actual attempts on the market brought in Jimmy Kebe, Cameron Stewart and Marius Iliakis, and they probably made things worse. Then GFH decided to sell off parts of their stake in the club and nearly cannibalised themselves by running opposing ownership attempts. Then the mad shit really happened on Mad Friday, which took place a full month after the real Mad Friday.
Alright, here's the
Shut up. So Massimo Cellino comes in. He's the new owner, one with 22 years of experience with football, with Cagliari, and one that actually fits the Leeds model since he'd sacked about 36 managers in that time frame, and he does what he does best immediately, sacks McDermott. He'd previously been blocked from buying West Ham on grounds that he was a wrong'un, and in his first night as quote-unquote Leeds United owner, heads continued to roll as Chief Executive Paul Hunt and Managing Director David Higg, who was part of GFH's opposing consortium, also left. Who was the moral high ground in all this? Yes, Flamingo Land, obviously. They pulled their support from the club. Still, Cellino wasn't done. Andrea Tabanelli was signed from where else but Cagliari, only days after signing for Cagliari. And Ross McCormack took to Sky Sports News to back Brian McDermott. Still the same day this, by the way. And it turned out that Cellino wasn't even the official owner yet and couldn't do any of this mad shit anyway. Eventually, Cellino would get his 75% stake from GFH as McDermott gingerly stepped back into shot and McCormack stepped back into the score sheets. By April 2014, Cellino was officially the owner, redid all his hard work, and in the midst of all of this nonsense, Leeds United's position in the league had just been about the most stable thing ever, as he dropped 2 places and 4 points down to just 15th. Cellino's tactic mirrored the local governments of its day, austerity on a crippling level, right down to the draining of the four-part swimming pool. Not that it translated to a more spendthrift approach on manager payouts. David Hockaday lasted 70, Darko Milanic lasted 32, and Neil Redfern lasted over just 200, a comparative eon. Those are days, by the way, not matches, as Leeds finished 15th again. When Leeds did get some money, £11 million from Fulham for Ross McCormack, Cellino spunked it all largely on blow-ins from Catania, Cagliari of course, Palermo and Sassuolo, all of Serie B. In the end, Cellino was banned by the Football League, told everybody that would listen he wasn't returning, then returned, sacked Neil Redfern and his wife Lucy Ward despite the glut of young talent they had nurtured through the first team, and hired Uwe Rosler. He lasted 12 games, Steve Evans only 38, and Leeds remained in what is now called the Preston North End position, inconspicuous mid-tableness, going from 15th all the way to 13th. That glut of young talent had all quickly come and gone, namely Lewis Cook and Sam Byron, who had quickly identified the clown show for what it really was. In the end, a broken clock is always right twice a day, and with the hiring of Gary Monk, Cellino was finally able to drown out the more bloodthirsty fans who had just about gotten sick of his dogshit ownership. And still it wasn't enough. All that swimming against the tide just to collapse into a gut-wrenching 7th place finish and then see your local rivals get promotion via the playoffs anyway. As Huddersfield Town was starstruck by their new place in the Premier League, some of that positivity finally bled elsewhere in West Yorkshire.
Welcome back to Ellen Road. Delighted to have you here this morning following last night's fantastic victory against Derby, and to introduce you to our new co-owner, Andrea Radrizzani.
It finally returned to Elland Road, where the ownership of the club passed from one Italian to another and to Andrea Radrizzani. He ended all the fun Leeds United supporters weren't having. He was allowed one fumble, and that was replacing Gary Monk with Thomas Christiansen, but it's safe to say that was quickly corrected, after the Paul Heckingbottom malaise and return to 13th. And see what happened next. If you're a goldfish or have just been literally born, watch our video on the Marcelo Bielsa days at Elland Road.